Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now the Quadro P620 here shouldn't be confused with the K620. The reason I mention this is because I did just that, only I assumed that the P620 here was the weaker card. In actual fact, this low profile Pascal product came out 4 years later and boasts DX12 support, meaning that it can still run modern games. I was even able to swap out my RTX 3050 for this thing without having to reinstall the drivers. I don't know if using game-ready drivers is commonplace or standard practice with a professional workstation card like this, but I was even able to use Shadowplay to record game footage internally. Not the best idea for benchmark videos as it knocked about 2 to 3 FPS off the overall performance, but it saved the need to buy an adapter to record footage externally today. The P620 here came as part of my £99 untested graphics card bundle, and it's one of the better cards I found in the box. It tends to sell on its own from anywhere between £70 and £100. The best way to describe this thing would be to say it's like a cut down professional version of the GTX 1050. An actual 1050 would probably cost less in a lot of places and perform better, but I have not tested one of these before and there aren't that many videos here on YouTube, so I thought we'd see what it can do when it's in action. So here we are in Battlefield 5. Now I've had to turn the resolution scaling down in order to hit 60 FPS. With 100% scaling we still were hitting this, but there were a lot more drops below it, so this tends to be the best way to play. It doesn't really look too bad. We are of course using the low graphical preset as well. You can of course play at a native lower resolution if you wanted to, but I thought that, accidental kill there, very nice. I thought that 1080p with a reduced internal resolution scaling was the better way to go. Now I'm not very good at this game, never have been, but even I can play it and still get a few kills with an aging and, there we go, weaker card like this one, which is always good to see. I just don't think it's worth buying one because they seem to be a bit too expensive for what they actually offer. Take that. A 1050 would make much more sense for purely gaming purposes, and even that's going to struggle these days. In Cyberpunk 2077 here, I've turned the FSR option on because at native res, we're going to see a lot of dips below 30. It still does drop a little bit towards the high 20s, but most of the time it tends to stay above 30 FPS. I'd actually recommend perhaps imposing a cap at 30 FPS to play this one with this card. Now the P620, almost forgot the name of the card, almost called it a K620 again. The P620 boosts up to 1354 MHz on paper. Take that, pedestrians. Some cards actually boost higher than what they state on the specs, but this one just goes to 1354 and stays there. It doesn't, or at least I haven't seen it go higher than this. So far I haven't seen it hit higher than 1354, so what it states on paper is pretty much what it's going to boost to. But this is certainly a more workstation intended card, as described. Elden Ring is a bit of a disaster on the P620 here. It runs, but it's 720p gameplay. 30 FPS is a bit of a struggle in busier areas, although it's not uncommon to see 40 FPS plus in quieter zones. Let's see if we can just wipe this bloke out here. There we go, a few hits with the sword. Not very good at this game either, never have been on PC. I tend to play it a lot more on PlayStation, but it is a fun one. I do enjoy myself here, and it's good to test because I never know how it's going to perform. Sometimes it runs really well, and sometimes it, in this situation, doesn't. The card itself gets up to around 60 degrees, not much warmer. The fan is always on. Because this is a professional card, I don't think there's been as much emphasis on quietness or noise reduction, but these smaller low profile cards tend to just keep the fan running anyway, even gaming ones, so it's not overly noisy. I'm not sure if you can hear it in the background of me recording the audio here, but it's okay. It's quiet enough, cool enough, and it can play some games just fine, but not Elden Ring. Although, if you don't mind lower resolutions, then you could get away with it. Okay, so here we are in Fortnite. I'm using DX12. This isn't the performance mode API. This is DX12 with the low settings but far view distance and TAA enabled. Over 60 FPS is achievable here, though I wouldn't recommend going much higher than the low settings. I don't really think you need to anyway. Just far view distance tends to give us a nice experience as long as we can see the enemies, which apparently I can't here. Oh, there he is. There she is. I can't really complain too much here. Low settings, far view distance, TAA enabled. The game still looks great, runs fairly well as well. So yeah, Fortnite is more than playable on a card like this one. If you can find a really cheap one, then of course it's okay, but if it's more expensive than a 1050, then don't bother. Forza Horizon 5 here runs nicely with low. Once again, I've had to implement a dynamic resolution scale option here, otherwise there are more significant drops. That wasn't a very good piece of driving at all. But overall, it actually averages out at close to 60 FPS. Busier areas like this, areas that are sort of more in town, will drop towards 40 FPS, but for the most part, the experience is pretty solid. And you might want to implement a cap, perhaps 30 FPS, maybe 45, something like that, but it's actually okay. It's more than playable, in fact. So GTA 5 runs absolutely fine, high settings here, perfect. I mean, there's nothing to complain about. The game looks fairly good at these settings, runs at about 60 FPS, a few dips below that. I'm using the i5-12400F, so the card has no problem reaching its maximum potential, and I've also got 16 gigs of 3200MHz dual channel RAM in the system. Please excuse me, I've got a bit of a cold. Speaking and breathing at the same time is quite hard to do today. But let's move on to our next game. Whoops. Where our 2 gigs of VRAM and basically everything else about this card struggles a little bit more is in Spider-Man Remastered. We can get 30 FPS, but I've had to make some serious sacrifices. The very low preset with pretty intense FSR. We do have a sharpening option, thankfully, because otherwise the game looks even blurrier than this. You can use ITGI as well, which is the game's own sort of upscaling feature. That makes things look a lot blurrier, but the FSR mode has a sharpness adjuster, so I prefer to use that here, and it runs a little bit better too. Over 30 FPS is doable, but it's not going to look very good. Lowering the native resolution won't help either. You're best to just select 1080p and use the most intense form of FSR with this one. Now, Red Dead Redemption 2 doesn't look brilliant with the low settings. To be honest, it's the texture work that really looks quite horrible at the low setting more than anything else. But actually, it's not totally unplayable at 900p with the newly implemented FSR 2.0 enabled. This is what I'd recommend if you're playing on one of these cards. It's hard to gauge how the Quadro is going to perform on a game-by-game basis. Some games it does better than I thought, like Cyberpunk, and others it does worse than I thought, like here in Red Dead. I thought we'd get a slightly better result than this, but there we go. It is what it is. I wouldn't recommend one for gaming. For workstation purposes, yeah, fine, but on a strictly gaming perspective, I thought I'd check it out anyway, because there aren't many videos here on YouTube of these in action, and it's nice to see what it can do, even if that isn't much. But if you enjoyed this one, leave a like, leave a dislike if you didn't, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one when I'm not finding it such a difficulty to breathe. Thank you, and goodbye.